All right, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We are going to get started. I want to thank all of you for joining me today. My name is Jennifer Morris, and I am with MadCap Software. And today we're going to be presenting a guide to using MadCap Flare in a globally distributed team. So if you work with other writers or subject matter experts in different locations, or maybe across the globe, and you're looking to optimize how you all work together, how you all collaborate, perhaps increase your visibility or break down those silos that can often develop, then I am so glad that you're here because you are in the right place. Joining me today to talk about this is Barb Einarsen, who's a Flare user and also the founder of Clarity Writing Services. In fact, today's presentation is adapted from her session that she presented here at MadWorld 2018. In San Diego earlier in the year in June. And it offered helpful guidance on how to overcome the challenges of being part of a distributed team. So welcome, Barb. I'm so glad you're with us today. Now, we've got a lot to cover, and I just wanted to review a couple of quick housekeeping items before we begin. So reminder, we will be recording this. So if you have to pop out early for whatever reason, not to worry. When this is done and all compiled, we'll be sending out a link to everybody that's registered so you can view it at a later time. Also want to remind everybody there is a question panel in the GoToWebinar console. So if you have any questions that come up as Barb is presenting or anything at all, feel free to use that questions panel to jot it down, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end. Whatever we don't get to, however, in fact, all the questions that are answered, along with the recording, we're going to be also including a question and answer document so that everybody can see the questions and answers that came up in the course of the presentation. So that pretty much covers the housekeeping tips. So I know, Barb, you've got a lot to talk about today. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn the mic over to you. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Really appreciate it. All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to be talking about, like she said, MadCap Flare, globally distributed teams. So this presentation is going to be organized in about 4 different chunks. So first we'll introduce exactly what the situation was that I'm talking about. Then we're going to spend an incredible single slide on the opportunities of going global, because the positives about going global are pretty self-explanatory, and I think we all know them. And then we'll spend more time on the challenges that come up from being globally distributed. And that's going to be probably the first third of this session. And then the last third is really sort of a case study about what we did to overcome some of the trust issues and to break down some of those silos and barriers and try to create a really unique, cohesive, globally distributed writing team. So that's the agenda for today. I've already been introduced, but yes, I'm Barb Einarsen, and I do own a company called Clarity Writing Services. I'm based out of the Toronto area. And here's what we're going to talk about. So in this case, I'm really talking about writers that are distributed globally, but I do feel that, you know, it really could be, you know, some of the lessons learned can expand out from that if there were, you know, we also had courseware designers as part of this overall team, but it could also be maybe you're remote from your project managers or your product owners, your Scrum team. So I do feel like some of the concepts can stretch out, but the exact situation where the case study focuses was about globally distributed writers. And in our situation, those writers, although they may have had some kind of team lead or manager locally, more often they did not have that, and they had that globally distributed. But regardless, they all kind of trickled up and reported into a central person. Now, if that central reporting didn't happen, you could still use some of the things that we talk about in the case study, but I do think that you know, it might be slightly more challenging to try to get buy-in from you know, try to get buy-in from different areas. And then I also want to talk about the fact that the writers here, the growth or the global acquisitions could have come from actual company acquisitions, or they can also come as part of an organic growth. And you'll kind of see later that that can factor into some of the cultural issues or thinking later on. And also whether those writers happen to be internal kind of permanent employees, or whether they're contractors, or whether they're actual outsourced company who may have permanent employees or contractors of their own, is kind of, it doesn't matter. This situation covers, or the topics in this presentation will cover all of those types of situations. So this didn't happen with me as my own little company, because really I'm pretty much a sole proprietor. You know, I'm working at a contract right now through Clarity. It's happened when I was at a much bigger global organization called Verint. So Verint itself, it's a global leader in its space, and it has several divisions. And one of those divisions was called Customer Engagement Solutions. So that one is where we're talking about, you know, workforce optimization and analytics type things. That's what we worked on. So we were part of the CES division. And then just to trim it down a little further, within that division, there was a group of writers or content development team called Content Champions. And that's really where this story takes place. So just to give you an idea of where we were when this happened. And then where in the world were we, right? Where are the global locations? Here's a view. The green dots, when you see one in Tel Aviv, you see one in Alpharetta, Georgia, near Atlanta. Those green dots represent big offices where you've got not only development centers, where you'll have product managers and scrum teams and what have you. You also have some type of documentation management, either a team lead or a manager on site in those locations. Then if you look at the yellow dots, where we've got some in the Ukraine, some in California, some in, actually it's Virginia, right close to Washington, DC, those were also offices where they had either project management or full development centers. You'd have scrum teams, you'd have, in some cases, sort of program level management. And those are where you have multiple writers. So not as many as in the green offices, but, you know, 1 to 3 writers in those yellow offices. And of course, those people, you can imagine, if you're in an office with lots of writers and a manager, that's a big influence. If you're all by yourself in an office working with 2 scrum teams, then those scrum teams become also a big influence. Something interesting to think about. And then we have a couple of little blue dots, and these are your remote people. They're your remote writers, for example, and they might report into one of the greens or one of the yellows. And in fact, some of the other blues and greens and yellows report into sometimes a blue. So for example, I myself am the little blue dot over the Canadian border near New York and Ohio and what have you, in Michigan. And just south of me, the yellow dot had a writing manager that reported to me, and she actually managed people in the other yellow dot in the Ukraine. So it's all quite a big crossover, but I think this gives a fairly good visual of the kind of global distribution that we were encountering. So that's just a bit of an introduction, kind of gives you a feel of the lay of the land when we talk about this story. Hopefully you guys will find that that's similar to what you have, or at least you can see that your situation might fit with our situation, and that will help you figure things out. As I said, opportunities, listen, we all know it's mostly positive if you can be part of a global organization. The whole world has been going global for quite some time, and so I'm only spending one slide on this, and I bet you could fill it up with a bunch of different things that are equally valid. But here's what I wanted to share. just thinking about different global locations, you're already just using logic, you will have to have a wider variety of skills and experience if you have people who are just physically in different locations. And why is that? Well, they've had a different university structure. Perhaps they've had a different education stream to learn about their craft. They have access to different local companies that they've probably worked for that have different ways of doing things, and have found maybe different best practices than you found in your location. So the wider the variety of skills and experience in your writing team, that's nothing but a benefit. And if you do, if you really look at it that way, then you're going to really try to discover all the best practices your people think they have, put them together, and find the real best practices that you want to use in your organization. Okay, so those first two very obvious. The third one's very obvious as well. If you've, and it's likely the reason you've ended up global in the first place, is you're supporting local teams in one way or another. You're either supporting a local language. I've seen that happen where you'll have literal translation be part of documentation department. Not in this case, but that's happens. Or more likely, you're supporting a Scrum team, you're supporting a developer, a QA, a product manager, a tester, a product owner, any sort of those kind of roles, or getting some local writing support. So that's another great reason to support to have your global teams. And then of course, and this is more of a human factor. Let's take away for all the logical, practical, good for business side of things, because that's not our whole world, is it? I would love to travel the entire globe in my lifetime, and I'm certainly going to give it a best effort. But there's always going to be places I'm not going to go, and there's going to be cultures I don't encounter. There's nothing like a global team at work. If you really can get some engagement, you can find out a lot about different perspectives from different people around the world. You know, maybe my mushy side, I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that's a really positive thing, and I think it's pretty powerful. So if you're having that opportunity right now where you're working, maybe you're working with some developers in another global location, or maybe you've got some writers there, try to find out more about, what is the perspective of life, what kind of cool things might that culture have to offer your own thinking. Anyway, there you go. Once in a while I'll get a little philosophical, but not for too long. We'll just move off that right away, and we'll start talking about some challenges. And before I even go to the next slide, I bet everyone can think of the very first challenge that you're going to encounter on any sort of global distributed team, and that is time zones. That's great. I love Slack. I love asynchronous communication, Confluence, Jira, fantastic. But once in a while, you have to, if not face to face with somebody, you definitely have to voice with somebody. Think of all of us here today. I'm pretty sure we're globally distributed. And sometimes you really can't get information across any better way than talking about it or sharing it on a screen. And that means meetings, and meetings take into account time zones. So in our particular situation, and certainly there's others that are more difficult, or equally, difficult. Right now, I often work with people in Australia and India, but then I was working with people in Europe and the Middle East and North America. So if you think about that from time zones, I'm not too bad. I'm, whatever, different. But when you start trying to get people in California to talk to people in Tel Aviv and the Ukraine, that's really more than a workday's difference. So it gets a little challenging. Probably the first thing you guys thought of too, time zones. Then the other thing I'm kind of lumping together, and I go into it a bit more, it's culture. And culture, I'm not really, I'm going to use that like 5 different ways and never define it because, just like a typical communicator. But really what I'm going to talk about for this first part is just the simple things like your office hours are different, not just because of time zone, but because some offices, so in some cultures, everyone would leave at you know 3 or 4 and go and do other things, and they might work from home later. Or in other offices, people wouldn't come in until 10 a.m. sometimes in North America, and then stay later. And so there can be just small things like that that in the background people might notice, and it might start to just um, build a little resentment possibly, or mistrust or misunderstanding. Holidays, of course, is a big one. Each culture has their own set of holidays, and things that are considered off are off. And of course, if you have a global company, hopefully they're accommodating those globally. But a lot of times when you just have 1 or 2 groups on top of, and of course I'm North American biased, that's where I live. So if you're North America and you just have 1 or 2 groups outside of that, you might not have done anything special to think about holidays and holiday planning. And then, of course, vacation time itself. I mean, there's quite a few European countries that aren't going to, that are sort of mandated an almost 5-week vacation schedule. And you might have someone in the States saying, well, I was lucky to get 2. Um, so it can be kind of interesting. And here's where these kind of things sort of show up, or at least I notice them showing up. You're trying to get California and Europe on a call, and they're being asked to get up at 7 and get on the phone for the call. And they're like, well, why do they have to leave in their afternoon? Couldn't they stay a little later? I mean, 7 a.m. seems pretty early. And then people who maybe from the other side of things are saying, well, why do you want to meet so late? I mean, how difficult is it? You don't have to go to an office, just roll out of bed and call from home. I mean, I've got, to take my child to, soccer. I've got like my evening plans already set. Daycares end early here. It can be very interesting. So some of these things, just kind of note them. Because what you're going to want to do is realize that those kind of questions can lead to a sense of distrust, or lead to some sort of resentment that's unnecessary. It's easy to get past, but you don't get past it by ignoring it. You should at least pay attention to that kind of thing. So obviously lots of things influence culture. I mean, physical location. If you're all sitting in one room in Tel Aviv and there's, 5+ writers sitting in a room talking to each other, they're going to have their own little subculture. They're going to have been making decisions, thinking about best practices, thinking about, the way they want to do things in their own way. And then, of course, every acquisition, like I said, brings it on. So if you've ever been in a company that acquires other companies regularly, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And let's put it this way. I wasn't hired by Verint. I was hired by Witness that was bought by Verint. So I, of course, associate myself as a Witness person. And while I was there working with people, they said, well, Witness bought us, Blue Pumpkin, 5 years before that. So we're really Blue Pumpkin people who are kind of getting along with the Witness people, who are kind of getting along with the Verint people, and it kind of goes on and on. So acquisitions definitely can, you never know, it's one of those things, you never know how alike you are until you're in a different situation. And then, when you are looking really across the globe, not just across a country, there can be some substantial differences between whether someone is just being direct or someone's being rude. Someone's being indirect or someone's lying. Whether you follow some sort of chain of command or whether every voice counts. And I have an example of that. Let's say I was in a meeting with my team and my manager, and I said, well, the sky's purple, as you know, and that's going to release on Monday. And everyone in the room would probably realize that the sky wasn't purple, it was probably blue. But there are some people who would never correct me because my manager was there, and they would feel that it would be rude to do so. And they would, in their mind, they would be respecting the chain of command to send me an email later. Never mind the fact that then I would have to send out a whole new announcement saying that what I said in the meeting was wrong. That's how they would think of it. And then another person would have no problem saying, "You're wrong. It's blue." Or even politely, "I think you meant to say blue." Doesn't really matter either way to me, but how that person is thought of by the rest of the group and how the one who kept quiet is thought of by the one who speaks up, it can be different. It's just something to notice when you're kind of drilling down on what makes up a culture. And of course, none of them are really, there's nothing right or wrong about it. It's just things to notice. So why do we care so much about noticing all these, honestly, little piddly things? To me, it's because over time, the goal should be, if you're part of a globally distributed team, is to form your own small cross-border culture based on stuff you care about. So what we definitely tried to do at that company, and I would hazard to say that we were pretty successful, is to create a subculture of us content champions wherever we were in the world, whether we were remote employees, in an office, contractors, outsourced, whoever we were. We felt that we were helpful to each other, and we felt that other people were helpful to us. And we felt that no matter what was done, feedback was gratefully appreciated because we were always trying to continuously improve. And we also could have, once you get over some of these moments of distrust and moments of slight resentment and break down some of those barriers, then you can start feeling friendly and have some fun. Someone you're a little bit resenting or you don't really trust is impossible to have fun with. So those are the kind of values that we were trying to build in our team. And that's what, when we talk about the whole case study about how exactly we tried to do it and what seemed to work and what didn't, that was our goal, is creating this little band of writers around the world. So then, still talking about challenges, so let's just talk about silos. I mean, those are, it's not really culturally related, it's physical. It's a lot more physical than that. And here's the way I look at it. When you've got people in main offices, so whether they're all in the same room or they're all on the same floor or what have you, you're going to end up naturally aligning. You're going to have lunch together occasionally. There might be nights out at the pub. There might be all sorts of opportunities to kind of talk about what you're doing. And what you end up doing, whether you realize it or not, is you end up making your own little best practices. You know, a little example of that. Writers in one of our offices, I guess, had gotten together enough and they decided that we don't really need screenshots. And in fact, if you're going to put a screenshot in, it better add some amazing little bit of value or it's just a waste of space. And so, that became a rule for the global team without really a global discussion. And then all of a sudden, we heard from some lone in-office writers going, well, I'll be honest with you, my product manager, who's the one who approves my content, wants to see a screenshot after every step, regardless. And it's easy to see that, you maybe need to have that conversation a little bigger if you really want a change to happen. It's a little bit of a change management process, methodology. You can't just tell somebody something, you have to get them to also believe in it. So anyway, main offices, people naturally align. Fair. The small groups in offices, and this is kind of a similar, the example supports it. If you're a writer by yourself in an office of 100 people and you work on 3 teams with 3 product managers and teams, you're going to start doing stuff the way that they like it done. You know, they're the ones reviewing your content. They're the ones that know what your content is. They're the ones that are actually approving it. So the fact that some, you know, ivory tower person decided screenshots weren't used anymore can be interesting. And then finally, you've got these remote writers, and you're usually hiring like pretty senior people to do that. And they generally come in, boy, they have their own way of doing things. And if you're not careful, they'll leave the exact same way. And you wouldn't have learned anything, best practices that they've gained along their experience. And you would not have let them learn anything from how you do things. So just a way to think about it. A little bit about silos. All right, that's enough about challenges. You guys might have come up with all sorts of other challenges. And if at the end you could, you know, if you could actually tell me what they are, I'm interested, because I find this whole subject interesting. And no matter where I work, I tend to work, all my work tends to be global in some way these days, and certainly remote. So I'd love to hear any of the opportunities or challenges you'd want to share from your own experience. Maybe if you could add it in to the question notes, they'll pass it along. I'd appreciate it. So now hopefully that was about a third of our time. It might have been a little closer to almost half of our time, but now we're going to talk about the case study of what we've exactly done to mitigate these problems and get to that global culture. And I'm going to start with this quote, not because I know that much about George Washington Carver, to be fully transparent, I don't. But I do absolutely love this quote. You need a vision. How do you identify leadership at your company? I have a thought, and maybe this is a little philosophical as well, but I have a thought. You know, there's always those people at your company who notice problems. Those people are very valuable. They can always see what's missing or where there's a problem or where there's a requirement gap, and they'll mention it. You know, it's no good to just notice it. They'll mention it. But you may also notice that it may be the same person, or it may be a different person, where they'll either think of a problem, notice one, or they'll hear about one from these people who do bring them up, and they are gold. You know, mine them, because they are gold. But they will not only just hear the problem, they'll almost immediately start spitballing solutions and ideas. Those are your leaders, in my opinion. Really pay attention. Those people can bring you somewhere better. Okay, we created a global leadership team at this company, and we did that first alignment, which is so critical, which is we all wandered off and made a vision of the future, and then came together and sort of had a hash out session. And during that hash out session, we either tore down someone's idea or we built it up. And the ones that we built up became our content strategy roadmap. So for us in that particular case, the roadmap idea was to come to a common voice. So you've already heard we're about a 20-odd-year-old company of content that's come from acquisition, outsourcing, contract writers, and in-house writers over those 20 years, all sorts of different ones. Let's finally make it so that the audience, our customers, could open up any of our content and believe that they were reading something from our company. Things would be presented in a consistent way. Things would sound consistent. That was our goal. So we just did our first baseline, low-hanging fruit. At the time, we were using FrameMaker and WebWorks, so we got everyone on the same version, and we got everyone using the same templates. And then we listened to those people who notice problems, and we listened to those people who spitball solutions, and we decided that we had some issues and requirements that needed to be addressed. One was a centralized workspace. One was an agile authoring and publishing environment, and another was better quality checks. Those are the ones I'm going to focus on for this presentation. So, how do we start from there? Great ideas. Good. We have a vision of the future. We have a plan. Well, do we have a plan? So that's when we broke it up into initiative teams. And we did that strategically to take people from different global areas, different product areas, perhaps different silos, and put them together and told them to solve the problem. I think we picked excellent people. We had actually a high quality team to pick from. And we put them into 3 different teams, or 3 teams I'll talk about for this presentation. One was kind of the writing quality team. It was also known as the topic-based writing team. The other one was an Acrolinks team. And if you haven't had the chance to use that little gem of a product, let me tell you, it's fantastic. It's an automated editor. And then, of course, the one we care about the most, because we're all here, thanks to MadCap. Thank you, MadCap. The Flare core team. So let's go and see what happened with them. I'll start with the non-Flare stuff. They had goals. And, really our goals were things like English as a second language readers should have an easier time, for example, for Acrolinks, or, goal-oriented topic-based writing is what we wanted to pick for the quality writing standards. And then they had deliverables. So, pick a style guide. Put together a guide that focuses just on what's unique about your content. And then something that I'm sure is used today, if not daily, weekly, were some pretty magnificent checklists by that quality writing team, where you could say, okay, now I know that was my, that was my task topic, that was my workflow topic, or what have you. And Acrolinks deliverables, well, they had to actually implement the system, and that wasn't an easy task. And then they wrote a guide on helping the rest of us use it, and they ran reports to show. And that was one of the other nice things about Acrolinks. It actually, because of the reporting, showed that you'd made some sort of improvement. And I think we all know that it's not so easy to quantify improvement in content development. So anything you can use to help is great. Okay. And then we've got our Flare core team, and because it's my favorite, it gets its own slide. They needed to implement a system that satisfied our requirements. So it didn't just start off as Flare. We had to think about what kind of system would satisfy our requirements. And if you remember, we needed a central place to work. And we needed something that would support our developers going to Agile, so an easier or agile writing or authoring area, and an easier agile publishing type area, and we needed something that would give us that visibility across the globe that we didn't have. And I'll be the first to admit, we had people who thought source control was putting your files on a network share. And we had people who thought source control was uploading to an old and clunky system once after every release for posterity. So glad to say they have TFS now, the TFS backend and a Flare front end for that. We implemented right before Central was released. So I think we would have gone Central if it had been there at the time. Maybe they'll go later. I don't know. Okay. So then we also, that Flare core team needed to provide a migration path and an infrastructure for the writers. I mean, obviously 20 writers of different levels of experience across the globe aren't going to be able to, you can't just say, migrate to Flare. We really tried to make it bulletproof for them. And I'm sure I'm talking a lot more about that later, but just that was a big part of that team's work for, probably a little less than a year. And then, of course, like all management teams, we expected the world, and for some reason we got it. But we were going to do this across the globe in a single release cycle. 175 deliverables, rebranded 3 different ways. Not a problem. Okay, let's see what happens. Yes, I mentioned this. They implemented Flare, implemented Team Foundation Server, and those two pieces together became our light content management system. This was the first time across the globe, and think of how much this did to break up barriers and dispel distrust. You could finally see all the topics and all the deliverables that every team is working on across the globe. It was all visible to you through our Flare TFS combination. And that was the very first time that was possible. And it was significant. Okay, so that's great. We migrated to Flare. Thank you for joining us today. No, part of it was talking about the initiative teams. Of course, they were what helped build that global trust. But let's really talk about how we got there, okay? First of all, of course, we didn't just pick Flare out of a hat. We spent over a year of investigating all sorts of XML editors and DITA and other tools. And really, this is true when I wrote it, and I think it's true today. It really is a different product than what else is out there. It's much lighter. It's much more supportive for a writer. And it's very, very powerful. When you think about having to rebrand as much as we do, it would sometimes take us weeks after a cycle to get the content into each of the brands. And now each brand is just its own target. So just that button push is really all you need. It's quite substantive a change. That's something to think about. So of course, yeah, you got Flare, great, but we really needed that centralized source control. And we really needed that global access to content. That was one of our requirements. And I think once people saw how easy it was, it made a lot of sense. I'll also mention, out of our writers, we only had two other writers that had used Flare, and I think 4 that had used Flare or something similar in the past. So out of the 20 plus writers, it was a pretty big learning curve for the bulk of them. So just something about that unique situation. All right, so that's great. We did all this research for a year. We decided we wanted Flare and we wanted TFS and we wanted this light content management system, and that's great. But aside from having a budget just handed to you, you need support to make these kind of changes. So here's what we did. We started with the peers. So the writers knew what the problems were. The managers knew what the problems were, but it was invisible from everyone else. So when we would go to localization, we went and talked to people in product development and product marketing. We talked to development leads, we talked to testing leads, and we sort of talked about the problems we were having and the fact that we'd found a solution that could fix them. And so we sort of built a base of peers that at that point could see the problems you were having and were kind of in agreement with the vision we had for the solution. Then once that's done, you can go and present your ideas to upper management and of course the executive team that generally handles the purse strings. So here's the thing. Especially at the executive level, like some of your peers might have seen you struggle, but executives and upper management never sees the struggle, because unless your help or your guide has prevented a software release, for example, I work in software, so possibly it's different in other industries, full disclosure, unless they have seen it stop a release or they have seen customers actually take the product and return it for a refund and said, the reason is because I could not understand the documentation. If neither of those two things have happened, your need is completely invisible, no matter how much you think you've talked about it. So try to sell it. It's the same know your audience that we writers are actually pretty darn good at. Sell what you could be doing. If we had this new system, all those times we said no to rebranding for a new client, we could say yes, because we're going from a couple of weeks of effort to an instant effort once it's set up. Do be careful when you're selling what you could be doing. Just if you have a team and you're thinking of this from the management side, you don't ever want to sell efficiency. It's very easy to sell efficiency, and it's very quick, and you'll usually get a lot of money faster. But then sometimes they expect you to have a layoff afterwards. So if you don't want to go down that route, then let's just find other ways. Another thing we sold to upper management was the fact that our content could become a market differentiator, because we could have that single voice and that higher quality a lot quicker. So yeah, describe the problem from their perspective and use their own lingo. Consider environment. Here's what I'm thinking. We all had the development team, as I think I mentioned in passing, thinking about moving to Agile. Well, if they're going to move to Agile, that means you also need to be more responsive. So we kind of built on that to gain traction. And yeah, that's it. You're selling. It might take longer than you think to sell up the chain, but it's definitely a worthwhile opportunity, and it's a worthwhile thing to do. Don't stop doing it until you get the funding, and when you get the funding, report back frequently so they feel like their money was well spent and they'll spend again. Just a little thought. So in our case, we talked about the rebranding effort. So them saying yes meant we could say yes. We talked about the market differentiator, and we talked about the fact that our current system was already kind of unsustainable, and if they want things quicker, that's not going to be possible. So just in case this helps you with your own sales pitch, thought I'd add that slide in there. And I also thought I'd add this slide in because for whatever reason, visuals, especially with upper management executive work. So we talked about how each project we started later, and then because we had to negotiate when we could do things and things got delayed, and then we worked on the delayed stuff, we started even later the next time, and how that ball works. And you can see if these are useful for your own sales pitch. All right, so this is great. You sold it to upper management, your peers were already on board, your writers already knew the problem. So now that you've gotten the funding, there should be nothing stopping you. Hold on. People don't like change. So as much of the complaints you may have heard and the writers thought it was a super good idea, now that they're faced with actually doing it, the attitude can change. And here's some things we had to kind of realize. So we had to do a sales cycle on the writers as well. And here's why. The writers were scared of making a big change before the next release, and they were right to be. But we'd also hired with an eye to FrameMaker expertise. So we had people with, 10, 15, even 20 plus years experience in FrameMaker. They're experts. And it's really hard to take off that expert crown and put on that propeller head of starting again. And then the fact that we had very few people who'd used any type of, so Flare or any type of really topic-centric authoring systems before. I mean, FrameMaker is a book-centric, if you see what I'm saying. So at that point, you might be a little taken aback. You thought the easiest sale was, and it turned into the hardest sell because they see it's actually going to happen. Someone actually said, it's like the train is leaving the station and we can't get off track. And they were right. So you have to become a little bit of a change agent. So here's some things that I learned when I was doing this for the company. If you think you're over communicating, you probably need to do a little more. I was shocked at how many times I had to say the same thing before it kind of filtered through and percolated. Um, and then also, just like you sold up the chain by really thinking about things in terms of their own lingo and their own needs and what would be useful to them, do the same thing when you're talking to the writers. You know, yes, it's a new tool, but you're going to find it very easy to use. One of the things we used to sell that idea was the fact that we created a pretty substantive Flare getting started guide, and that included all the information about how to prepare your FrameMaker files for migration, how to migrate them, how to clean them up afterwards, and then how to do your first run through test to make sure your content was the same. And the person who wrote that guide, for the most part, actually had never used Flare before. So that was something we could say. It's like even someone who'd never used it before created this guide, you know, last week to help you. And then, of course, rely on the team. Don't try to do everything yourself. You know, the whole core team spent a lot of time paving the way. And then also in our case, we certainly weren't shy to get some expert help. So I bet not a lot of you have heard of Scott Deloge. We brought him in to do our first set of migration instructions and build our first master project. It was a good, useful investment of funds, highly recommended. And then in fact that we kept this guide and then we kept growing the guide. In fact, grew to over 200 pages of really writer-specific, usable, actionable content by the time the whole thing was done. And then we also got some Flare training that may have been fairly basic Flare training, but it was incredibly based on our environment, which means they used our Flare Getting Started guide, our master project, and our Flare project samples on how to migrate over. So to get everyone on board, you really have to get everyone at least to touch it. So despite resistance, everyone has to touch it. Everyone has to use the same guide and the same master set of, you know, template files, for lack of a better word. And then they could come to us for any help or troubleshooting or coaching. And of course, when we did our migration, we migrated all the way through to publishing so that they would have that help set where they could go page by page with the old one and make sure everything's as expected, or that PDF and go page by page and make sure everything's as expected. And then just a little bit more on our formal learning. I'll just make sure we're not getting too late here. No, we're still good. We definitely brought in a company that would do morning sessions for Europe, afternoon sessions for North America. And like I said, they actually used our own environment. And it was fairly affordable to do that. And then informally, you know, really we had a message board, we had coaching sessions, we used a lot of those kind of group chat things. And then we had regularly scheduled communications. And those regularly scheduled communications included messages to upper management executives showing them where their money went and how successful it was. We actually kicked off with the other writers as far as the migration part of the project in July. And by March, we were over 90% done. So the only edge cases were things that weren't needed for the next release. And then by the time, you know, a little bit later, we could consider ourselves 100% done within the year. I can't take credit that this happened between a single release because we were so magnificent. I have to give full, you know, encouragement to the development team for delaying that release so many times. So thank you, development team, for that. Few other tips before we're at the end. You know, manage through. It's not over till it's over. If you get buy-in or agreement, don't stop communicating. If I kept up the communications with the team, like with the writers the whole time when I was selling peers and upper management, it probably wouldn't have been as shocking as it was. Keep whatever guide you put together, your little doc Bible, keep it up to date as you grow. And then it's great to have migration, but you really have to follow that project through to the authoring stage so that you're authoring new content in the new tool. Again, doing this with a global team and having a lot of initiative teams, a lot of team meetings, and a lot of global communications really made all the difference. And at the end of it, it really did feel like a single content champions team, no matter where they were on the globe. A little bit of our guide here, you know, just for you to look at later, the layout. And here's the end of the day. So we did it. And what happened? The writers love Flare. Even the staunchest, I'm a frame maker, you know, God, through and through, love using Flare. They love the fact that they have separate TOCs and targets for each brand and each output type, that every deliverable has that target, and that it's just so quick and easy to generate them. And I will say they've kind of gone a little farther. It says in progress because it was in progress at the time, but what they, you know, using TFS like a development team where you can branch and merge your content is possible with Flare because it's a text-based file system instead of binary file system. I mean, images excluded. We managed to get some automated publishing to SharePoint, and definitely some automated publishing to a testing server that also tested the help through Artifactory. So there's a lot of things you can do further down the chain once you finish that migration and you've got writers writing. And then we have one single online library, which we had never been able to have in the past, which had all the topics, whether it happened to be in a PDF or help, for the same version. You know, the cross-content search became possible. That was an amazing project. In progress at the time of the slides. I should probably update it. And that's it. I hope it was useful for everyone. I really appreciate the chance to kind of talk about the topic and talk about the little case study that we did. And if I'll just hand it over now to Jen to kind of give some advertising, and then I believe there'll be some question period time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barb. That was so helpful. I just want to review the slide real quick for everybody. While this is up, feel free, if you have any questions for Barb, anything that came up about strategy or best practices, feel free to drop a question in the questions panel. If not, that's okay too. But just feel free to use it if anyone has a question for her. But just as a reminder for everybody, we've announced MadWorld 2019. It's going to return to the Hard Rock Hotel in San Diego, April 14th through the 17th next year. So we should have session and speaker details available soon, hopefully by early October. So keep checking back to our website. If you've signed up for this webinar or anything else, and you are in the marketing canon, and you will be notified, I promise. But always come back to the website and give us a look if you have any questions there. So I'm looking over, and we're sort of right at the end of the hour. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to the audience. Again, if they have any questions at all, feel free to jot them down. I don't know, Barb, if you want to give out your email address in case somebody thinks of something after the fact, maybe they can get a hold of you somehow. Maybe you want to drop your email address up there in case anybody's shy. That's fine too.
That's fair. Yeah, let me see where, and I apologize, where I could do that here. Let's
Maybe
just trying to see if I can add to the chat window. Yes.
Yes, you can.
There you go. Type a message to the entire audience. I'm blasting you all with my email address, everyone.
Yeah. And we can include it too for everybody that registered if they don't catch it in the chat. There we go. So barb.einarsen, EINARSEN @gmail.com easy. So feel free to jot that down, everybody, and send Barb an email if any questions come up after the fact. But with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I want to thank the audience for attending, and Barb, thank you so much for your time. That was so useful. I have just invite everybody to visit our website again to our live webinars page, where we will have additional webinars posted. So check back and see if anything is interesting. And for everybody that's attended or registered, we will be sending out a recording for this after the fact once we get everything compiled. So thanks again, Barb. Thanks to everybody that joined, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week and a restful weekend. Thanks, everybody. See you on the next one. Take care.
Bye.